birthday and this birthday in the middle of a pandemic. So whatever, what a pain. But okay, so I'm going to talk about the weirdness of Jeffersonian liberalism today. This is I'm going to talk about the Chesapeake. I want to talk about wheat because wheat's so critical. And I'm the 28th of March, and I want to talk about economic liberalism, and by that I mean kind of free market liberalism. Congrats, Arian. And I also want to talk about the tension between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and also about Haiti and what's called the Haitian Revolution. All right, excellent. A lot of marches. Okay, a lot of whatever that is, Aries, I guess, or something. No, Aries. I don't know. Anyways, okay. So we talked about this before. I just want to review some stuff. We talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and it's just to clarify this because it's a little bit confusing. When the issue is the Constitution, Pisces, okay, Pisces and Aries. When the Federalists, when the period is the Constitution from 1787 to 1789, there are a group of people called the Federalists who support the Constitution, and a group of people like Patrick Henry here on the right who oppose the Constitution or are suspicious about the Constitution. And so this conflict ultimately leads to the Federalists ultimately win, but the Anti-Federalists also win to the extent that the Bill of Rights is established and ratified by the states, and so we get both a constitution but limitations on the power of a federal government by the Bill of Rights, right? And so the tension, though, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists goes away by 1789, more or less. But we get around 1789, 1790, I had that 1789, but I would say 1791 to 1811, we have what's called the first party system. And this is the system that no one wanted, a system of two parties where people were opposed to one another. And the confusing thing is that the Hamiltonians are also called the Federalists, right? They get the term Federalists. Good morning. And who are the Federalists? The Federalists are New England merchants. The Federalists are ship owners, and there's a lot of ship owners in the American colonies in this period, and lots of sailors tend to be Federalists. This includes people like Alexander Hamilton. In places like New Jersey, this includes some African Americans who are voting actually in New Jersey, some women who are voting in New Jersey. So the Federalists are a kind of complicated party. They're sort of the party of the elite, but they're also the party of sailors. They tend to be the party of the sort of Atlantic coastal folks, and they tend to be somewhat pro-British, these Federalists. On the other side are the Jeffersonian Republicans, and this is, again, it's a confusing term. The book calls them Democratic Republicans, and that's just a term of art we've come to use to describe them. They actually call themselves Republicans, and they despise the word Democrat because the word Democrat they associated with the French Revolution, and anybody who was a Democrat was basically wanted to cut off the head of the king and was likely to, be so supportive of democracy that they led to chaos. But let's call them the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians. This is a weird mix, remember, of New York large landowners on the one hand, and Southern farmers and Western slaveholders. Yeah, well, the book calls them Democratic Republicans for complicated reasons. Basically, the Democratic Party of the New Deal era of the FDR and others embraced Jefferson and said that they were the party of Jefferson. And so they called the Jeffersons the Democrats, even though the Jeffersonians hated that term. And so now historians have come to basically more or less call them Democratic Republicans because the Hamiltonians called them the Democrats. What they called themselves was Republicans. Yeah. So the weirdness of Jeffersonian liberalism is basically, I want to talk about this Jeffersonian party and the weirdness of their ideology, I guess. So the weirdness of Jeffersonian liberalism is what I call it. And they are, yes, Democratic Republicans. The term they used at the time was Republicans. The term that we've come to use since is Democrats or Democratic Republicans. just to make things complicated. And this was the botanizing excursion. Remember the New York large landowners on the one hand, Southern elites like Jefferson and Madison, but a lot of Southern farmers as well. That's right. The Federalists of the constitutional period and the Hamiltonian Federalists are different groups, more or less. It's a little bit of continuity. Hamilton was a Federalist, in the Constitution, and he was a Federalist after, but Madison was a Federalist in this period, the time of the Constitution, but he became a Democratic Republican later. So the parties don't match up easily onto the Constitution. So a simpler way of saying this, and that's what a lot of historians do, is talk about Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, which makes it a little bit more clear what people stand for. Okay, so this is it. This is our first party system: Federalists versus Republicans. And okay, bear with me here for a second. I got lost. So the expectation was that the Constitution was going to destroy a party system, but we do get a party system. Now, what's up with these Democratic Republicans? Well, one of the things that activates the Democratic Republicans, that assures that people like Jefferson and Madison are in power in Virginia, is that they support the Western Virginia as opposed to Eastern or Tidewater Virginia. And this is an important religious difference here. So if you ever go to colonial Williamsburg, you'll see churches like this, these Anglican churches. There's actually one on William & Mary's campus. The Anglican churches were very hierarchical. They weren't. They were anti-Catholic. They were Protestant, but they're very, very hierarchical. The Anglican minister stood at on this podium. He was raised above others. He read a little bit of the Bible. The people who were sat in the pews in an Anglican church tended to be the very large planters of the coastal elite. These are people who were Christians, but didn't let Christianity get involved, interfere entirely with their affairs with other people, with gambling, these were also gamblers. These were also people who, according to the Baptists and Methodists from the West, were nominally Christian, but not especially observant. The Anglican Church was the power, and it was the elite that was at the center. No, Western Virginia. So West Virginia is off here. But this is what's called Western Virginia in the 1770s. Sorry, it's a little bit confusing. This is the Eastern Virginia, which is Anglican. This is Western Virginia, which is Baptist and Methodist, primarily. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's these Baptists and Methodists, remember, who didn't want to have to pay for the Anglican Church. It was the Baptists and Methodists who thought that people should have liberty of conscience and should be allowed to go to the churches that they wanted to. These churches in the back country, places like Hanover County, Amelia County, Chesterfield County, Powhatan County, these are the counties where also Madison and Jefferson live, Louisa County. These counties are pretty far away from the coast, as you see, pretty far away from the rivers. And this is where a lot of the Scotch-Irish folks end up, and they become Baptists and Methodists. The Baptists and Methodists basically said the Anglicans were sort of Catholics in disguise. They pretended not to be Catholics, but they were just as smitten with old traditions, just as hierarchical. So the Baptists and Methodists were also, many of them, or some of them, anti-slavery. The Baptists and Methodists believed that slavery, that we were all a kind of human brotherhood, that some of the sort of ideals that all men are created equal come from the Baptist and the Methodist Church. We think of the Baptist and Methodist Church now maybe as being somewhat hierarchical, but at the time it was a very radical and often quite strongly anti-slavery, right? Okay, so this is the Baptists and Methodists. They're kind of anti-slavery. They're super democratic. They're opposed to the rich folks who are the Anglicans on the East Coast. The Quakers as well, but as well as the Baptists and Methodists, saw the contradiction between the principles espoused in the Declaration of Independence and the enslavement of others. This is why I think this tension between Baptists and Methodists on the one hand and Anglicans on the other help explain in part why in this period Virginia was quite ambivalent about slavery. This is why you get somebody like Thomas Jefferson who owns enslaved people and yet believes that slavery is wrong. People like George Mason, who in his lifetime free all of the slaves that he owns and declares himself a Republican. Madison does not free his slaves, but free some of his slaves, enslaved people. And so we see in Virginia in the 1770s and 1780s a lot of manumissions. This is not, in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, the state says slavery is over, right? In New Jersey and New York, they say slavery will be over within 10 years. In Virginia is sort of half and half. It appears to be starting to abolish slavery, at least individually, on the part of some people who believe that slavery is a terrible thing. Now, this is different from South Carolina. South Carolina is 60% enslaved people. In coastal South Carolina, it's like 80 to 90% enslaved people. This is an African society in some ways. This is the people are many of them are from Senegambia, but this is a society that's very hierarchical, in which the enslavers. This is in the 1780s. So yeah, turn of the 19th century, from say between 1780 and 1800. Slavery in the lower South, in places like South Carolina, it's the majority enslaved. Intensive agriculture. South Carolina is the richest place in the world for white people. Similar to parts of Jamaica or Barbados, where you have lots of enslaved people for every slave owner, and much more of an African society. So this is a society that's terribly concerned about revolts by enslaved people, in which white people are not prepared to even talk about ending slavery. When Baptists and Methodists come to Charleston, they are driven out. They are sent out on a rail by white people in Charleston. George Whitefield and other Baptists and Methodists get no sympathy and no interest in places like Charleston by slave owners, because they see Baptists and Methodists as threatening to the whole hierarchy of slavery. Okay, so Virginia is a little bit strange. Virginia is also strange in tobacco, because tobacco can grow in a lot of places, but what tobacco needs ultimately is fresh land. Unlike rice and indigo in South Carolina, which can be grown again and again and again in the same soil, tobacco saps nitrogen from the soil, and so fresh land often produces more tobacco than old land. And in fact, if a plantation in Virginia, they would set up tobacco fields, 15, 20 acres on some place, grow tobacco there for 5 or 6 or 7 years, and then head further west, because the land was no longer capable of supporting it. And so lots and lots of tobacco is grown further and further west. A lot of people who are slave owners move to the west, keep continually moving to the west, to land that's still got black soil. You see a lot of the area around coastal Virginia, all the way up to Richmond, basically being sapped of nitrogen. Crop rotation would have worked. People didn't really understand at the time that peas and beans were the things that revivified the soil. But tobacco is really awful for the soil long term, and even with crop rotation, you still get much better growth in lands where you basically cut down and burn the trees. The way they did it was they would burn the forest in a kind of controlled burn. They would then take the tree stumps and wrap them to prevent make all the leaves go away. And then they would, and then that potash that comes from the burning of the wood is actually really great for planting tobacco. So a burned landscape is actually ideal for growing tobacco for the first 4 or 5 years, and so that's what people would do. Okay. Okay, so this is, so tobacco is grown further and further in the West. Further and further into these areas like Hanover County and, sorry, bear with me here for a second, Amelia County, Amherst County, Nelson County, and others. The other thing that happens, the really important thing that happens, bear with me here for a second, is that wheat prices skyrocket from 1700 to 1800. And so Virginia increasingly shifts from tobacco to wheat. Tobacco prices are going down in the 1800s. So if we had tobacco prices, they'd be going like this from 1700 to 1780. Sorry, I guess you can see my cursor there. Heading downward. And wheat prices are shooting upwards. Why would wheat prices be shooting upwards in, say, this period from 1750 to 1800? Why would they be shooting up? They shoot up all the way up to 1815. What's going on in Europe that would lead wheat prices to go up? Feeding militias, okay, during the revolution. Good. Feeding the Caribbean colonies. The other thing that's happening, the French Revolution. Excellent. So one of the things that's happening is the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Wars. So from basically 1789, feuds between France and Britain from 1760 all the way up to 1815 when Napoleon is finally defeated. From 1750 to 1815, France is at war with Britain, and that's awesome for wheat producers because U.S. ships can go to Spain or Italy and sell wheat because so many soldiers are at war. Food prices skyrocket. But the other thing that they can do is feed the Caribbean colonies, and the Caribbean colonies, again, are basically net importers of food, and so that's also important. But yeah, warfare, really, between France and Britain means that that Americans can sneak under the blockades of France, or, there's supposed to be a monopoly that Spain has in Cuba, that France has in Martinique, and yet, because of the war, basically American farmers who have, or American ship owners who have wheat to sell, can find any port basically and make a fortune selling wheat. And this is what Philadelphia wheat prices are looking like. Wheat prices in Guadeloupe or Havana or Saint Domingue or Jamaica are skyrocketing also because of these wars between France and Great Britain. The great thing about the revolution for the Americans is that once the American Revolution takes place, the U.S. finds it hard to sell to the British Caribbean, but they find markets in the Danish and Swedish and French Caribbean. So the actually market for for selling flour to the Caribbean actually goes up considerably. Okay, so this is Richmond. This is an image of Richmond around a little bit later than the period we're talking about. But you see here the James River is the place, leads all the way back into, pretty far into the backcountry. And this wide river allows the importation of wheat from the backcountry. And so what farmers are doing increasingly is growing wheat as tobacco prices are going down and wheat prices are going up. The thing about wheat that's interesting is wheat is basically a weed. It can grow pretty much anywhere, and wheat only requires about 2 months of labor. It requires about maybe the planting takes about a month. Then you leave the wheat alone basically You do a little bit of weeding, but not that much with wheat. And then you harvest it about 3 months later. And you then thresh it and send it in wheat barrels, which then go down to Richmond. And in Richmond, they're turned into flour barrels. And those flour barrels are exported to the Caribbean. So the biggest flour mill in the world is in Richmond. The second biggest flour mill in the world is in Baltimore. So Baltimore and Richmond, also Philadelphia, have tremendously important flour mills that are producing flour. But the thing about slavery and flour, slavery and wheat, is that slavery isn't much suited to wheat, right? If it only takes 2 months of labor to grow wheat, it's not entirely clear what owning an enslaved person for 12 months benefits, right? Tobacco requires suckering and weeding and transplanting and then drying. It's a year-long process. But wheat is only a 2-month process. And so it turns out that small farmers who are growing on their own in a family can grow wheat more cheaply than an enslaver with a large number of slaves. And so what we see is a kind of advantage, I think, to wheat growers who are mostly family farmers. Okay. So here's what the world looks like then for Thomas Jefferson. And this is why I want to talk about the weirdness of Jefferson's ideology. Bear with me a second. It doesn't make sense to own slaves. If an enslaver had 40 enslaved people and they worked on the crop 2 months out of the year, there wasn't a whole lot to be done the rest of the year. This starts to convince many slave owners in the Chesapeake that slavery doesn't make sense at all. At the same time, there are these evangelicals like the Baptists and Methodists who are anti-slavery, and they're reaching men like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson. George Mason writes in the 1760s, one of the signs of the decay and perhaps the primary cause of the destruction of the most flourishing government that had ever existed was the introduction of great numbers of slaves, an evil very pathetically described by the Roman historians. Many others, like Jefferson, are convinced that slavery will die out soon because wheat prices keep continuing to go up, tobacco prices keep continuing to go down, and based on his experience in the Chesapeake, he believes that slavery is doomed. The people who roundly disagree with them are the slaveholders of the Lower South, in South Carolina and Georgia. Rice prices don't show any signs of declining. There really aren't many Baptists and Methodists in the Lower South in this period, and they are violently, as I said, Whitefield and others, the Baptists and Methodists, are violently attacked in the press and on the streets. So one of the weird things about Jefferson is that Jefferson is a slave owner who's uncomfortable with slavery. I think it's partly for this reason that Jefferson becomes increasingly persuaded by what we call Adam Smith's liberalism, and that's we see Adam Smith's liberalism, economic liberalism, in what's a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's published in 1776. All right, this economic liberalism is a sort of what I would argue is a kind of a revolutionary capitalist ideology. With Smith is not that original. He really synthesizes a lot of ideas. But Adam Smith's ideas are, first of all, this idea of an abstract market. That the market wasn't a thing in the countryside. That's what a market was in the 1600s and the 1500s. The market was this thing, this abstract thing that was all over the world. To quote Smith, the market is an invisible flow of goods and payments girdling the globe. And so this market is all over, all around us. Writers like him see order in the diverse transactions traced to these human bargainers. And so this is where we get the term invisible hand. Okay? So this is where we get the term invisible hand, and this is why I have that creepy picture in the background. You've heard this expression, invisible hand. This invisible hand is this idea that there's an order in the diverse transactions between people, human bargainers, not classes, but self-interested individuals who somehow determine prices by buying and selling. So the liberals in this sense, this Adam Smith's economic liberalism, that believe in a common human nature. This is very different from the Federalists. The Federalists believe that people are impulsive, fickle, passionate, unruly, and likely to come to no good end, regardless of what they did. That's the term. Right? Yeah. Sorry, it's a creepy image. But they believe that so the Federalists tended to believe that the common people were dangerous. Whereas Smith and others believed that everybody was a bargainer and there weren't really classes and that everybody was right? Everybody was a bargainer. So the new view in this economic liberalism is of limited government, of uncoerced transactions. They imagine that if you just leave this system alone, everything will take care of itself. Generally, this idea that there ought to be fixed prices for flour, fixed prices for wheat, fixed prices for other goods goes away. That there ought to be basically limited government, and people are going to do their best the less government there is. And finally, that people are basically bargainers. There aren't classes, that everyone is buying and selling, everyone is on this market. This has a focus of a laser beam, I would argue. There's no concern about religion, about culture, about class. People are just buyers and sellers in this. Yeah, laissez-faire is a good, grows out of this, or is a term that's associated with this. In many ways, according to people who are opposed to this, it's a kind of hollow and soulless ideology. But this is economic liberalism, and this is a kind of thing that ultimately is for Thomas Jefferson, who sees these rapid economic political changes taking place in Virginia. This is a soothing ideology. Yes, tobacco, which had been the soul of the Virginia economy, seems to be slipping away. Well, whatever. People will make decisions based on the market. They'll grow more wheat. Slavery will go away. Everyone will be happy. And so there's this idea about economic liberalism that appeals to Thomas Jefferson. He believes that slavery is going to take care of itself, that it's gradually going to disappear. It suggests a kind of equality, weird kind of equality that Jefferson accepts. When Jefferson goes to Washington, coming from France, to serve on George Washington's cabinet in the 1790s, he starts to do the Federalist Party scene, which is not kegs and grain alcohol. It's sort of it's dinner parties with wine, and this is the top of the pyramid in Anglo-American society, and he's revolted by it. He really doesn't like it. Jefferson constantly finds himself supporting democratic change, while other Federalists assert that the people are inherently brutish. The Federalists look back to the battles between creditors and the majority in the Confederation period, and so people like Fisher Ames, who's a Federalist, says men are often false to their country and their honor, false to duty and even to interest, but multitudes of men are never long false or deaf to their passions. Many, Cabot says, do not think at all. The delusions of democracy, like other delusions of the human mind, cannot be resisted by reason and truth alone. Reason will not answer. Reason will not protect your houses, ships, and stables from thieves. You must have the protection, the controlling fear of God and fear of government. Yeah, he supported actual democracy in some sense. This is very confusing because this is somebody who's a slave owner, right? But at the same time, he's sort of repelled by the hierarchy and this idea that there's a kind of closed circle of virtuous men that are going to serve the republic. He believes that the farmers who he represents in the western part of Virginia are basically the soul of democracy. I mean, it's a kind of a strange thing because it's democratic, but in a certain kind of sense. And so this is why it's weird. This is why it's hard to get your head around, because he believes in laissez-faire. He believes in a kind of democracy, but he's also not especially, he's quite anti-Indian. And he has racist beliefs, absolutely, about black people. And so this is what's strange, the weirdness, again, of Jeffersonian liberalism. So let's review a little bit who's who. So the Federalists, what do they want the government to do? The Federalists want land to be sold in large chunks. So very large, very wealthy people will acquire the land. That most of the money coming into the federal government will come through land sales, and these prices should be high. And wealthy people will acquire this land and work it with other people. They're going to use the revenue from this land sales to build up cities because Federalists believe in big cities. They believe that democracy is dangerous. That's why they call their opponents the Democrats. And they tend to be very British, right? They tend to favor the British. So this is the party of John Adams, right? Who initially, and as we saw in the chapter, supports the Alien and Sedition Acts, which say if you criticize the government in a newspaper, you can be jailed. If you are from a foreign country and you don't immediately declare for citizenship, then you can be also be jailed. And so the Alien Sedition Acts are an attempt to round up people who support the revolution in France, put them in prison if they're formerly French citizens who are, but more particularly the Sedition Acts. Anybody who criticizes the government can be jailed. Okay, so this is the ideology of the Federalist Party. This is, and there are a bunch of other things that John Adams does that I won't go into too much detail about here, which generates tremendous opposition by the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists also support the first bank in the United States, right? They believe that there ought to be a bank that provides credit, and that this bank will provide credit to the United States, one half credit to U.S. Whoops. Sorry about that. I shouldn't be editing this while we're talking, but whatever. And one half credit to merchants, right? So these are the things that they support, the Federalists. By comparison, Jefferson's Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, believed in small land holdings. They believed the smaller the land holding, the better. That land in the West should be as cheap as possible so that smaller farmers can get access to it. They believe in democracy, although it's democracy for white guys, right? It's not democracy for African Americans. It's not democracy for Native Americans, but it's democracy for white people like themselves. When in the French and British wars, they say thank God for the French, our allies. And they strongly oppose the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so there's a lot not to love about these people. These people believe that the Indians in the West are savages. The Federalists also believe this. They tend to be, there are slaveholders in the Democratic Party, certainly, like Jefferson and Madison. And they are, but they support a kind of democracy that's important for the longer term United States because, for example, the fact that you can criticize the president now and not get arrested, that you can criticize wealthy people now, people who are public figures like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or something like that. I shouldn't say too much about Jeff Bezos on this channel, but you can criticize those people and not be arrested. That's not true in Britain, right? If you criticize the king, you can be arrested. If you criticize someone who's wealthy in Great Britain, they can charge you with slander, and you can be arrested and fined. In the U.S., in large part because of Jefferson, there's a basically long-established custom that not only is everyone allowed to criticize the president, but you're also allowed, yes, it does, you're also allowed to criticize public people like Bill Gates, like Jeff Bezos and others, and not be sued for libel. Now, if you make things up about those people and it's absolutely proven that you've made it up, even still, if they are public people, According to Jefferson, go ahead. Go ahead and criticize them. And according to long-established U.S. tradition, you can go ahead and criticize those people. If they are not public people, if you take someone who you've never, who is not already in the public and attack them publicly, then you can be sued for libel. But public institutions, public corporations, and public figures can all be criticized in part thanks to this tradition that grows out of the opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, so here's what happens to land prices, and I apologize for the wonkiness of this image. And this is, my font is too big here, and I can't change the font. Okay, so land prices. Before 1800, under Adams, you could only buy, the minimum acreage that you could buy was 640 acres. It was $2 an acre, one half to be paid in 30 days, and the remainder to be paid in a year. This was steep. 640, that's $1,280. And at $2 an acre for 640 acres, the number of people that had $1,280 in 1799 or 1798 was less than 1% of the population. So this is a tiny group of people who are allowed to buy land, according to the Federalists. And the price is high: $2 an acre, one half paid earlier, and the balance in a year. Jefferson, in the Revolution of 1800, breaks it up. He initially proposes that people will be able to buy 3/4 of an acre. And rather than having that money up front, all they have to do is put up 1/4 within 30 days, and then 1/4 a year for each year thereafter. So you can pay it off in this period of 4 years, 5 years. And if you miss a year, you just pay it the next year. As long as you are continuing to make some payments, you can make this land. And so this is an important difference, and this is part of the reason why Jefferson wins in 1800. Is this policy is very widely popular. After 1804, and I'm sorry that it's cut off here, but I'll just move it up. After 1804, also under Jefferson, it's 160 acres. So half of that, the same terms as above, and a discount for cash. If you pay it in cash rather than in banknotes, then you get a discount. Okay, so that's what's appealing about Jefferson. That's what's sort of democratic about Jefferson. But the disturbing thing is what happens as people settle in these Western lands, which are relatively cheap. And the thing that makes this system, Jefferson wanted lots and lots of independent farmers who were non-slaveholders. He called them yeomen. These people, these non-slaveholders, would settle in the West, and they'd grow wheat, sell it on world markets, and do well. That's the hope. The thing that changes all this is cotton. In 1776, with the development of the cotton gin, we see a very different kind of society develop in the South. Cotton had existed and was grown in the South somewhat before 1776, but the cotton gin changes everything. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the cotton gin, because the cotton gin is it's in the South. So it's let me start with this fellow, Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney is an inventor in New Haven. He's he is hired by Nathaniel Greene's widow. Nathaniel Greene is a Revolutionary War hero in South Carolina. And Nathaniel Greene's widow, Catherine Greene, is looking for a tutor for her children. And she wants to get the best one she can. On a packet ship, she meets a recent graduate from Yale University, Eli Whitney, who's on his way down to South Carolina, supposedly to be a tutor. That tutorship disappears, and Catherine Greene hires him, pays him 100 guineas a year, pays him 50 guineas a year, which is more than a pound. I don't know. It's a decent salary. And she then also says that while this is not a whole lot of money, he can also apply his abilities with machines to help her plantation manager, Phineas Miller. And what Whitney does is figure out that the biggest problem for cotton is that cotton that grows in so there's cotton that grows on the coast, and cotton that grows on the coast is long and wispy looking, but cotton that grows inland, basically in sort of upcountry South Carolina and Georgia, a tiny little bit in North Carolina, and what's later going to become Alabama, is this kind of cotton that we see here on the right. And this kind of cotton has a massive seeds in the middle. I don't remember, honestly. So it says in the syllabus, but I don't remember. Okay, so this cotton is very heavy because of all these seeds, and separating the cotton from the seeds is very, very difficult. And what Whitney does is he creates this thing which separates the seeds from the cotton. So to take 1 pound of cotton and divide it and pull it off the stalk and then separate it so that you just have the cottony part and leave the seed behind. Process 1 pound would take all day. Okay, just separating those seeds. And people would take cotton and they would leave it by the hearth, and what kids would do is separate them. Oh, I see. Let's follow the syllabus for now. Yeah, okay. So I will actually drop 2 of the quizzes. I didn't say that in the syllabus, but I am going to drop 2. So sorry about the confusion there. That was sort of, I didn't mean to say it, but in fact what I'm going to do is drop 2 of the quizzes. Okay. Whitney sees other attempts to strip seeds from the cotton balls when he arrives at the plantation. In the off hours, he makes a small cotton engine, the gin for short, which uses steel wire instead of wood. And the engine has a fine metal sieve to mash the cotton against, and little hook-shaped wires that clean the lint off. Packback I do drop off too. Yeah. The rotating brush cleans the lint off the hooks, and according to legend, Catherine Green was the one who suggested replacing the wooden teeth with metal teeth to make the gin more serviceable. So Whitney goes off then, once he discovers this, and he discovers... Oh, sorry. Okay. So basically, you put the... you press... If you look at this image here, this top goes down, and you press the cotton ball, B-O-L-L, against the top of that thing, and what those teeth do is they scrape off the soft part of the thing, and those seeds stay on the outside of this thing, of that screen. And you do this repeatedly, and what you get is underneath you get lots and lots of the soft, fluffy part, and the seeds remain on the other side. So that's how cotton gin works. But you can crank it initially by hand, and then eventually even by water wheel or something like that, and very easily and very cheaply separate the cotton from the seeds. What that does is make basically this fat cotton, which is called short staple cotton, makes this fat cotton much, much more attractive for factories that are going to turn this into cloth. Because previously you use a little bit of this cotton, but you mostly use that long cotton. What the cotton gin means is that you could use this short staple cotton, which grows here. So let me, if you just look at this image for a second, long staple cotton just grows along the coast. This short staple cotton with all these seeds in it grows everywhere where there's 200 frost-free days. And so this is the attraction of the cotton gin, is it allows you to grow cotton in all of these regions. Whitney goes off to patent the gin in where does he go? He goes to actually, in Philadelphia, which is where the capital is at the time, to patent the gin. And meanwhile, people all over South Carolina and Georgia start growing cotton. And planters discover that Whitney's plan to gin the cotton, his plan is that he's going to gin the cotton, all the cotton, for himself, and take 1 pound of cotton for every 3 pounds that they produce. That's his plan, is that he's going to control and own all the cotton. He's going to have a monopoly on cotton. By 1801, someone then breaks into Whitney's workshop in South Carolina, examines the engine, and then it's quickly emulated all over South Carolina and Georgia. And what's important about this is that there are all sorts of enslaved men who have all these skills, have all these workplace skills, and it's enslaved men in part that are able to create this cotton gin. It's not just white Southerners; it's also black Southerners who basically take this and copy it. In 1801, in 1800, Whitney and Miller try to sue people for copying their cotton gin, basically taking over their patent, and they just ignore him. And judges in cotton-growing counties refuse to allow prosecution because they say, well, maybe he didn't invent it, or maybe somebody else invented it. There's all this controversy over it. And by 1801, Whitney and Miller give up and ask for outright grants from the cotton states to make the cotton gin public property. And even then, the southern states basically ignore him. And they go on producing these cotton gins. And he comes with offers to the various states. Only one state counteroffers. He gets $10,000 from Tennessee. A couple states make a few down payments. He got a total of $90,000, which is quite a bit of money. And then the states repudiate their agreements and sue Whitney because they say that he didn't really invent the cotton gin. He obviously did. He very certainly did, but they try to claim that he didn't. In that same year, in 1803, there's $10 million that's made by planters in cotton. And so this cotton gin is pirated all over the South, which produces a tremendous amount of value. The price of enslaved people doubles between 1793 and 1803. Manumission, the removal of slavery, the end of slavery, which had been widely discussed in Virginia, is forgotten. And Virginia and South Carolina begin to export enslaved people to other states. This is being sold down the river. It's not counted in the state's returns because how would you count it? But enslaved people were probably the largest export from Virginia after 1800. Enslaved people are sold down the river, separated from their families, broken up and sent off to Mississippi, to Alabama, to Georgia. At 39 years old, Whitney is penniless. He returns to New Haven, resolved to start over. Mechanics, black and white, who produce machinery needed for rice production, quickly adapt that rice stuff for this cotton gin. And so what we get then is cotton spreading throughout the South, and the idea of the end of slavery ending basically with the discovery of the cotton gin. Okay, transition here. I've talked about the sort of weirdness of Jeffersonian liberalism, that it is democratic in some ways, that it, in the sense that it's supported by Baptists and Methodists who oppose the Anglican Church. It tends to be opposed to hierarchy. It tends to support the expansion of wheat. It tends to believe that slavery, or hope that slavery, is going to disappear. There's a land distribution strategy on the part of the Democratic Republicans that it's hoped will cause slavery to die out over the long term. The development of the cotton gin, though, helps to produce a large number of people who want to profit from this cotton production once it becomes becomes clear that you can grow cotton almost anywhere in the South, anywhere where there's 200 frost-free days. And so what we see then is the expansion of slavery, not the end of slavery. Now, transition. I want to talk about how this man Toussaint-Louverture makes possible the uncorking of the Mississippi. Okay. A problem for the United States is a lot of the land in the West is relatively useless. That's not quite the image I wanted to show. I don't. Okay. So a lot of this land on the in these regions is relatively is not nearly as valuable as land on the coast for growing. If land is more than 40 miles away from navigable river or lake, it's impossible to grow crops and sell them. You can't sell crops in a regional or national market because wagoning your crops more than 40 miles away to a river or stream will eat up your profits. And so while you can live on your own, sort of in these areas, you can't produce cash crops, and relatively few people are willing to settle up in these hills and mountains where there are no rivers accessible. Most traffic on the Mississippi River and the Ohio River are on ships like this, that are called bateaux and rafts. Bateau is a French word. It's difficult to underestimate the importance of rivers. The fastest way to go from Cincinnati in Ohio, where are we? Cincinnati to Philadelphia is to go down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River, around the Gulf of Mexico, up the Atlantic Ocean, and then to Philadelphia. That's the cheapest way to get things from Ohio to Philadelphia. If you want to sell things in the market, on a grain market, if you want to take things to a miller, the person who's going to turn your wheat into flour, you have to ship it all this way around to through the Gulf of Mexico, around the Atlantic Ocean and back, because the cost to ship it back up the Ohio River is just prohibitively expensive. You can't just go across the Ohio River because the Ohio River flows in the wrong direction. The Ohio River flows down towards the Mississippi, and you can't go upriver in 1800. You can, right? So you cannot move in the opposite direction. You can only go where the river carries you, and the river carries you all the way down to New Orleans, and then you have to use a sailing ship to get all the way back up here. So you take a raft or a bateau down the Ohio and down the Mississippi, and then you have to take a sailing ship, transfer to a sailing ship to New Orleans, and bring it all the way back up. Okay, so this is an issue for places like Cincinnati, places like Pittsburgh, places like Louisville, Kentucky, places like St. Louis, Missouri. All of these places, which are relatively, are towns to a certain extent, and where farmers exist, they ultimately have to, any trade that they engage in has to go through New Orleans. And the thing about New Orleans is that in 1800, or the 1790s, New Orleans is controlled by Spain. By 1800, it's controlled by France. It's quicker to use horses, but the value would go away. So if you take say wheat and you grow it in western Pennsylvania, and then you want to ship it back to eastern Pennsylvania, you can load up a cart with horses, but then you have to feed the horses, and you have to go over the mountains to do it. The cost for just feeding your horses and the cost to hire somebody to transport, even if you do it yourself, the whole cost to get from by horse from west to east is gone within 40 miles. So 40 miles on a flat road is roughly the cost. Shrinks down, eats away at the value of the wheat until it's basically worthless. It costs you more to ship it than the wheat is worth to ship it in that direction. So the only cheap way to do it is to throw it onto a bateau, take it all the way down to New Orleans, and then put it on a ship and bring it all the way back up. That's cheaper than taking a horse and going 180 miles east to get to markets in Philadelphia. Does that make sense? It's crazy. It is crazy, but that's the way it worked. And because the Ohio River only went one way, this was the world, and so that meant the control of New Orleans meant control of all of this trade. It's hard to think that Pittsburgh is basically worthless without access to New Orleans, and what Spain is doing in New Orleans is charging a tax on any goods that are coming out of New Orleans. So the Mississippi is basically corked for places like Pittsburgh, places like St. Louis, places like Cleveland in Ohio. So France's problem. France is fighting a war with England in 1800. Most of the action is in India. Napoleon Bonaparte, who's the Emperor of France, assumes control in the closing years of the French Revolution. And at first, the major theater of war is in India. And then Napoleon has this plan that he's going to work with Russia against Great Britain, but then the Tsar Paul, is betrayed by his own son, who has him strangled. Tsar Paul's son refuses to ally with Napoleon, and Napoleon is now in 1800 stuck without an ally. The only place left to go is New Orleans. Napoleon buys New Orleans from Spain, right? I mean, imagine like hiring an assassin to strangle your father, right? Like, but that's also how the Ottoman Empire worked as well. You have people they usually hired assassins to strangle their brothers, but in this case in Russia, it was hiring an assassin to strangle your father. The only place left to go was New Orleans, and Napoleon buys back New Orleans in a secret treaty with Spain. And his plan is to go back to New Orleans with a force of 35,000 men, German, French, and Polish mercenaries, many of them committed to the ideals of the French Revolution, and they're going to establish France's military dominance in America. This 35,000 soldiers is larger than any single fighting force that was sent over by Britain. Their first stop, though, along the way, is Saint-Domingue. And I don't have a good picture of Saint-Domingue. How do I not have a good picture of Saint-Domingue? There we are. Saint-Domingue, which is the western and the French-controlled part of the island of Santo Domingo, which is Dominican Republic on one side and French on the other. This is the jewel of France. This is the most valuable part of France. So he sends this army of 35,000 men, but their first stop is Saint-Domingue, where they're supposed to quickly regain power there and restore some of the plantations and carry on. Restoring power? What's happened? Well, what's happened in Saint-Domingue is revolutionaries in Santo Domingo have proclaimed their own freedom during the French Revolution in 1791. They're led by this man on the right, Toussaint Louverture. Louverture. His name, sorry, I don't have it. Oh, there it is. It's on the right there, but He himself had been a former slave. Napoleon believes that Toussaint Louverture is wrong for having declared a French republic. Toussaint had sided with Spain, had tried to overthrow slavery in Saint-Domingue. And Toussaint had changed his name to Louverture, which means opening. And he allowed Louverture allowed deserters and stragglers into his camp to train soldiers and to work on his staff. Between April and May of 1794, he decides to break with Spain and declare a revolution and overthrow slavery. Napoleon Bonaparte believes that what he's going to do with these 35,000 men is take a brief stop in Saint-Domingue. Oh, sorry. So that's the original French term for the place, and sorry. So this is the Haitian, what's called the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint Louverture leading a group of enslaved Africans to overthrow their masters and create a revolutionary republic using the ideals of the French Revolution. These are Napoleon's soldiers. There's a kind of image of Napoleon's soldiers. And these are the Saint-Domingue soldiers, who later call the place. Bear with me here for a second. In Saint-Domingue, these French soldiers are supposed to quickly overthrow Louverture, reimpose slavery, and Saint-Domingue will become a slave colony again. Napoleon believes that the leader of the revolution in Haiti, called Toussaint, is, quote, a savage, and that the slaves can be put down by his battle-scarred troops. Now, this doesn't sound all that crazy. In fact, the French army is the most able army on the earth by 1800. The fighters are veterans of numerous campaigns in Europe. Napoleon said that this fleet was to bring the, quote, annihilation of black government, unquote, in Saint-Domingue. Napoleon's fleet arrives in Saint-Domingue in 1802. Where is the ship? Yes. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation, but this is the ship, and there are 80, right? Certainly a cocky person, indeed. These ships are going to, as he sees it, annihilate black government. Toussaint Louverture, seeing 86 white sails on the horizon, right? 86 ships, French ships of the line, on the horizon. He wept. And he said, friends, we are doomed. All of France has come. Let us at least show ourselves worthy of our freedom. The Haitian army was reasonably well armed. And this is really important. In fact, most of the arms had been bought from America as leftover weapons from the American Revolution. The American Revolution the American Revolution ends in 1793. The U.S. has all this gunpowder and rifles and other arms, cannon and other things like that they no longer need once the war is over. And those traders, right, those merchants who are in the Federalist Party, believe that arming the Africans in Saint-Domingue is not a terrible idea. They have lots of guns left over. They have lots of powder left over. And there's all sorts of great material in Saint-Domingue, all sorts of sugar and other valuables. When slaves took over these plantations, sometimes slave owners were freed, sometimes they were killed by the slaves, but there was a lot of gold and silver and things like that in Saint-Domingue. It was a very, very rich place. And so the Federalists, who tend to be pro-British, think, well, why not trade with the slaves? Why not trade with them? Why not sell them weapons and arms? We've got too many of them. And this is a French colony, and hurting the French is probably a good idea. So the weird irony of this sort of two-party system is that the Federalists and many Federalist ship owners sell a tremendous number of arms and weapons to a black revolutionary force that's going to be the Haitian Republic. The troops were very well trained because many of them had been trained by deserters and others in the French army. Toussaint had no qualms about taking in deserters and getting them to teach the soldiers how to fight. These are officers on the left. These are soldiers on the right. They knew also that failing meant losing their liberty. In many ways, this battle between France and the Haitians was a replay of the battles of the American Revolution. The French, just like the British, conquered most of the most important coastal towns and harbors. So if we look at the coastal towns, it's what's Cape Haitien and Port-de-Paix. Where else are we? Oh, these are the new names, not the old names. So there's an important port here, Port-au-Prince. There's an important ports up along here, and these are are still controlled, parts of them by the French. But there are lots of other ports that are controlled by the Africans in these regions. The major ports are quickly seized by the French. The French siege of Fort Quiraparo, which is, where is that fort? Apologies. I think it's on the. Sorry, it's just off the screen here on the western side, but it is successful. Napoleon actually captures it. Napoleon's men capture it, but it costs more than 1,500 French troops. There's a moment of uneasiness in which it's not clear whether this is a war over land or over a revolution. One French Republican general later recalled the weird silence among his troops when they heard the black defenders of the fort singing French patriotic and revolutionary songs. These people who had fought on the revolution, for the revolution in Italy and in Spain and in Germany, believing that they fought for themselves as citizens, were disturbed that the ideals of the French Revolution were shared by the Africans in Haiti. When Napoleon's general Rochambeau reached Fort Liberty, he found that Toussaint Louverture had ordered it burned to the ground, which was a smart thing to do. To burn the fort to the ground and leave it behind rather than try to defend it, which was also an American tactic during the American Revolution. In retaliation, though, Rochambeau immediately began mass executions of all black men, women, and children. The Bay of Mansonville was turned red with the blood of ex-slaves and biracial people who were called mulattoes. They died calling out, "Away with the whites, away with slavery." Napoleon's army grew more and more vicious as his plans for Napoleon seemed to be unraveling. Napoleon sent messages that all freed slaves of Haiti were to be re-enslaved, and all white women who had ever had any relationship with Saint-Dominguez were to be sent to France, where they would be considered prostitutes. To discourage attacks, the French soldiers would tie people together in little boats with small holes cut in the bottom so that they would drown slowly. Others would be forced to dig their own graves and be hanged over them. Oh, ship. Sorry. Yes, the ship was the Poursuivant was the French ship. It was the lead ship in that group of 86 ships with 35,000 troops that was supposed to land in Haiti and take it and turn it back into a slave regime. Toussaint had two things on his side, though: a superior knowledge of tactics and yellow fever. Right. He surprised the French generals with fast marches, ambushes, surprise attacks, raids at night, and fake skirmishes where they would pretend to attack and then retreat. Toussaint split the French forces and waited for the rains to arrive, which spread yellow fever among the troops. By 1803, less than 1/3 of Napoleon's troops remained alive. And at that point, with just less than 20,000, or just over 20,000 troops, the Polish members of the French army changed sides and joined the sides of the enslaved people, and the remaining troops were rounded up by the Africans in Haiti and the Polish French troops, rounded up and killed. Only a few thousand of the French army escaped back to France. Needless to say, the French never arrived in New Orleans. In 1803, Napoleon's army of 35,000 soldiers is gone. In a fit of pique, he goes to James Madison, an emissary of America, and offers to sell him the middle part of America for $15 million. And this is the Louisiana Purchase. So is it this what we could say to Americans could say thanks to Toussaint Louverture? His answer would be, hey, no problem. The success of the Haitian Revolution against Napoleon makes it possible for the United States to acquire not just New Orleans, but all of the region above it. Why? As Napoleon sees it, this whole area from New Orleans up into the west, mostly uncharted at this point, is only important for feeding Saint-Domingue, right? It's providing the food. It's James Madison and who's the other guy? There's somebody else. It's in the textbook, but it's basically the United States buys this for $15 million from Napoleon. Weirdly, the U.S. has a lot of money. How does the U.S. have $15 million? Well, it pays it off in installments, but the reason the U.S. has $15 million is because of all of this trading that these traders are doing on both sides. Because the traders, these ship owners, are trading with the enemies, all the different enemies of Great Britain. Whoa, bear with me. They're paying tariffs, and they're bringing in all these goods to the United States. And so the U.S. is sitting on a huge pot of cash, weirdly, in 1793 because of all of the trading with the enemy, trading with the French, trading with the Spanish, trading with the Dutch, all the trading with Haiti, in fact. And so the U.S. is sitting on a tremendous amount of money, right? And so it's at this point that the U.S. acquires this territory. No one knows how extensive it is. No one knows how large it is. Napoleon doesn't know. Even the United States doesn't know. And so this is what leads Lewis and Clark's expedition to try to actually find exactly how much territory was acquired in this period. So this is how ultimately. Oh, Livingston. Yes, thank you. That's the thank you, Steve. Livingston was the other person who was the agent. Oh, did I say Madison? I always get them confused. Apologies. As Steve Krug says, I got it wrong. It's not Madison. It's Monroe and Livingston who are the agents for the United States in this purchase. Okay. Are there questions?